1959. A quiet hospital room in Tokyo. The air carried the scent of disinfectant and the profound stillness of imminent death. On the bed, a 67-year-old man, a mere skeleton draped in skin, struggled for every breath. Nasopharyngeal cancer had gnawed him from the inside. A harsh but somewhat ironic retribution, as this very throat had once issued the commands that stole the lives of hundreds of thousands. No courtroom was convened. No noose was prepared. No firing squad leveled their rifles at his chest. There was only the quiet of a sick room, and a death considered peaceful due to illness. This was the final moment of Shiro Ishii, a sickeningly peaceful end. An unimaginable luxury for the man nicknamed the Architect of Hell, the doctor who turned human beings into experimental material, the doctor of death of the Imperial Japanese Army, the mastermind of one of the most brutal and horrific biological warfare programs humanity has ever witnessed. While his counterparts in Nazi Germany, the butchers of Auschwitz, Buchenwald and Sobibor, were dragged before the dock at Nuremberg. Judged before the entire world, Shiro Ishii died a free man. He died in a hospital bed, perhaps surrounded by his family in the very country he had served. Justice was not served. The wheel of history had taken a bizarre turn, and this monster had slipped through the cracks. How? How could the man who sowed the plague, anthrax, and countless other unnamed horrors upon innocent civilians escape judgment? How was his sophisticated killing machine, Unit 731, almost entirely erased from collective memory? The answer does not lie in remorse, repentance, or a shred of compassion. The answer lies in a deal with the devil himself, a bloody exchange where his terrifying secrets were traded for silence, where the data gathered from the suffering of thousands was deemed more valuable than the justice owed to them. The seeds of biological warfare. To understand this monster, to grasp the scale of the depravity and the price of silence, we must return to a time before the name Shiro Ishii became synonymous with war crimes. He was born in 1892 in a small village in Chiba Prefecture. Even from a young age, Ishii displayed a superior intellect, a mind as sharp as a razor, but it was accompanied by boundless arrogance and bottomless ambition. He graduated at the top of his class from the prestigious Kyoto Imperial University Medical School. But for Ishii, medicine wasn't about saving lives. Medicine was a tool, and he saw an entirely new use for it. In the 1920s, the world was still reeling from the nightmare of World War I. Mustard gas, phosgene, and the muddy trenches had redefined warfare. But Shiro Ishii looked beyond. He believed that future wars would not be decided by bullets or tanks. They would be decided by invisible enemies, by bacteria, by viruses, by plague. In 1928, Ishii embarked on a 2-year tour of Europe and the United States. He did not go as a tourist. He was a medical spy. He meticulously studied the aftermath of chemical and biological weapons in the Great War. He visited laboratories and research institutes. He spoke with scientists, but where others saw tragedy and the need for prohibition, as the 1925 Geneva Protocol attempted to achieve, Ishii saw only potential. He saw a cheap weapon with unparalleled destructive capability, a weapon that could elevate the Japanese empire to global dominance. He returned to Japan with a grotesque vision. He began lobbying, using all his connections and influence within the military establishment. Initially, his ideas were considered extreme, even repulsive. But Ishii was a brilliant salesman. He didn't speak of ethics. He spoke of efficiency. He didn't speak of suffering. He spoke of victory. He argued that Japan, a resource-poor nation, could not compete with the West in a traditional industrial war. But in biological warfare, everything was possible. A few grams of plague germs could wipe out an entire city. A handful of infected fleas could cripple an army. And then, his golden opportunity arrived. In 1931, the Mukden incident ignited the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. This vast, resource-rich, and chaotic land fell into the hands of the Kwantung Army. For the militarists, it was a new territory to exploit. For Shiro Ishii, it was a perfect laboratory, a colossal laboratory, outside international scrutiny, outside ethical rules, and most importantly, filled with an endless supply of what he needed most: human test subjects. He presented his plan to the Supreme Command. This time they listened. The Kwantung Army, the occupying force in Manchuria, saw the strategic value in Ishii's vision. He was given virtually unlimited budget and complete autonomy. In 1932, he established his first facility, the Togo Unit, at the Jongma camp near Harbin. But this was only the beginning. An escape attempt and a disease outbreak, perhaps deliberately caused by Ishii himself for testing, led to the facility's closure. Ishii needed something bigger, safer, and completely secret. He chose a location near the small village of Pingfang, about 20 kilometers south of Harbin, and here, the architect of hell began the greatest work of his life. Unit 731, the City of Death. To conceal its true purpose, the facility was given a harmless name, the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. Kwantung Army, a name of false humanitarianism masking a horrifying truth. They didn't purify water. They poisoned it. They didn't prevent epidemics. They cultivated them, and it became known by its code name, Unit 731. This was no ordinary prison camp. This was a city of death, a massive complex spanning 6 square kilometers, enclosed by high walls, barbed wire, and guard towers. It had its own airstrip, its own railway line, its own power plant, and even its own brothel. Over 3,000 Japanese scientists, doctors, technicians, and guards lived and worked here, dedicating their entire intellect to Shiro Ishii's mission. Inside the walls of Pingfang, there were over 150 buildings. There were colossal breeding houses, not for meat, but to raise millions of infected fleas and rats. There were production plants, not for making weapons, but to manufacture tons of anthrax, cholera, plague, and smallpox bacteria. And at the heart of it all were buildings 7 and 8, solid reinforced concrete blocks housing the special laboratories, where the real work was done. To fuel this machine, Ishii needed raw material. That is when the term Maruta was born. Maruta, which means log in Japanese. This is what the staff of Unit 731 called their prisoners. They were no longer human. They had no names, no past, no future. They were captured Chinese, resistance fighters, farmers, intellectuals. They were Russians, Mongols, Koreans. There were even captured Allied soldiers. They were tricked, kidnapped, or simply snatched off the streets. They were brought to Pingfang on secret trains, and from the moment they stepped through the gate, their existence was obliterated. They were reduced to numbers, logs waiting to be put into the furnace, but before that they had to serve Shiro Ishii's twisted science. The unspeakable experiments. Inside the laboratories, Ishii and his doctors began their work with cold meticulousness, a scientific curiosity utterly devoid of humanity. They regarded the Maruta as nothing more than guinea pigs. They wanted to know how the human body reacted to disease, not from textbooks, not from speculation. They wanted to see it with their own eyes. Thousands of prisoners were intentionally infected. They were injected with plague. They were forced to drink water contaminated with cholera. They were sprayed with anthrax-containing aerosols. Doctors clad in sealed protective gear stood outside the observation rooms recording carefully. They documented every fever, every seizure, every bead of sweat, and the gradual decay of the human body as the pathogen took hold. They recorded the exact time required for an adult man to die from the bubonic plague. But for Ishii, mere observation was not enough. To truly understand the effects of the pathogens, he needed to look inside, and this led to one of Unit 731's most heinous crimes: live vivisection. The Maruta, after being infected but before they died, sometimes even completely healthy, would be strapped down to an operating table. They were fully conscious. There was no form of anesthesia. Ishii's doctors believed that anesthetic could alter the experimental results, affecting the state of the internal organs. With a surgeon's precision, they used scalpels to cut their bodies open. They removed organs one by one, the heart, liver, lungs, kidneys, while they were still functioning, still beating in the victim's bloody chest cavity. The screams in these laboratories were muffled by the thick concrete walls. They studied the necrosis of the liver when attacked by bacteria. They observed the lungs contracting after inhaling poison gas. They did this to men, to women. They even did this to pregnant women, sometimes impregnated by the guards themselves. They dissected both the mother and the fetus to study the transmission of disease from mother to child. These logs never left the operating table alive. After the organs were harvested, the remaining body parts would be tossed directly into the incinerator. Every day, dark columns of smoke billowed from the chimneys of Pingfang, carrying the ashes of unknown souls. Shiro Ishii supervised it all. He walked the corridors wearing his spotless white coat, urging his scientists to work harder, to collect more data. He was an efficient manager, a dedicated scientist, and a demon in human form. Unlimited cruelty, but the brutality did not stop at disease. Ishii's ambition was boundless. He wanted to test every limit of human endurance, preparing for every scenario of war. And the harsh Manchurian winter gave him a perfect opportunity to study a new field: frostbite. In the freezing cold of 30–40 degrees Celsius, Maruta were dragged out into the yard. They were tied to stakes or forced to plunge their bare hands and feet into tubs of cold water. Guards stood by, continuously pouring water over their limbs. They waited until the limbs were completely frozen solid. Ishii's doctors walked around checking their product. They used small sticks to tap the victim's hands and feet. When it produced a distinct, dry sound, the sound of a piece of wood being struck, the experiment began. The victims were brought back to the laboratory, and here the true torture began. Ishii wanted to find the most effective method for rewarming. They tried everything. They poured hot water over the frozen limbs. Skin and muscle instantly peeled away from the bone. They tried cold water. They tried warming them by fire. They tried doing nothing at all, just observing the process of necrosis unfolding. All of it was meticulously recorded. Photographs documenting these scenes still exist, silent evidence of their depravity. Most victims died from shock and pain. The survivors were permanently crippled before being sent off for another experiment, or simply disposed of in the incinerator. Ishii's inventive cruelty seemed to have no limits. He wanted to know how conventional weapons caused damage. Maruta were tied to wooden stakes on a special testing range. At various distances, grenades were detonated. The goal? Study shrapnel penetrating a living body. They were locked in high-pressure chambers until their eyes exploded out of their sockets. They were hung upside down until death, just to see how long it took for the brain to cease function. They were starved and dehydrated, to determine the exact time a human could survive without food and water. They were injected with animal blood, like horse blood, to observe the immune system's reaction. They were spun in gigantic centrifuges at high speed until they died. They were irradiated with high doses of X-rays. No atrocity was too extreme. No idea was too perverse. All were justified under the banner of scientific research and war effort. Tens of thousands of lives were crushed under the wheels of this machine. The plagues unleashed. But for Shiro Ishii, laboratory experiments were only phase 1. His ultimate goal was always to weaponize these pathogens, turn them into weapons of mass destruction, and use them on the actual battlefield. Pingfang was not just a laboratory. It was a weapons factory. His scientists developed special bombs. Not bombs containing explosives, but bombs filled with fleas. Millions of fleas were bred at Pingfang, allowed to feed on the blood of plague-infected rats, and then loaded into ceramic bombs, designed to shatter on impact and release their tiny, death-carrying army. Planes of the Imperial Japanese Air Force, taking off from Unit 731's airstrip, carried out missions to sow death over Chinese cities and villages. In 1940, they dropped plague-infected flea bombs on Ningbo and Kuzhou, causing horrific epidemics that killed thousands of civilians. People died in the streets, their bodies swollen and blackened by the Black Death. They didn't just use fleas. They poisoned water wells. They released typhoid-infected flies. They distributed candy and cookies laced with bacteria to local children. This was no longer experimentation. This was war crime on an industrial scale. Shiro Ishii had turned vast areas of China into an open-air testing ground for his most despicable weapons. It is estimated that the biological warfare operations of Unit 731 and its branches killed at least 300,000, and possibly up to 500,000. Innocent civilians. They died in agony and panic, never knowing that their deaths came from a laboratory run by a doctor. Throughout the war years, Shiro Ishii stood at the peak of power. He was a general in the army, a hero in the eyes of the militarists. He lived lavishly at Pingfang, hosting extravagant parties, while just a few hundred meters away, the screams of the Maruta were being suppressed. He believed he was untouchable. He believed his biological weapons would bring Japan final victory. He even planned a large-scale attack on the United States itself, codenamed Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night. The plan was to use submarines carrying seaplan, fly them to the west coast of America, and drop plague-infected fleas onto San Diego and Los Angeles. The apocalypse designed by Shiro Ishii was close at hand, the deal with the devil. But then the wheel of history turned. August 1945. 2 atomic bombs leveled Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Ishii's empire, built on bacteria, suddenly became obsolete in the face of nuclear fission power, and an even greater threat was approaching from the north. On August 9, 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. 1.5 million Red Army soldiers poured across the border, crushing the resistance of the Kwantung Army in Manchuria. For Shiro Ishii, it was the end. Pingfang, his impregnable fortress, now lay directly in the path of the Soviet advance. Panic seized the complex. The dream of a superweapon was shattered. Now there was only one goal: conceal the crimes. A final order was issued from Tokyo and executed by Ishii with his usual cruelty. Destroy everything. Take the secrets to the grave. A frenzied purge began. All living Maruta, hundreds, perhaps thousands, still imprisoned in Buildings 7 and 8, had to be executed immediately. Not a single witness was allowed to survive. Guards threw grenades into the cells. They shot anyone trying to flee. They used poison gas. They drove victims down wells and opened fire, then filled the wells with dirt. Within a few hours, the last living evidence of Unit 731's crimes was wiped out in a final, bloody massacre. Simultaneously, Pingfang's most critical buildings were rigged with explosives. The laboratories, the breeding houses, the incinerators, all were blown up in desperate attempts to destroy the infrastructure. Millions of documents, patient records, photos, film footage were thrown into incinerators. The fires consumed the evidence of their crimes for days and nights. The remaining infected rats and fleas were released into the surrounding environment, causing a final post-war plague outbreak in Harbin. In the chaos, Shiro Ishii gathered his key personnel. He ordered them to disperse, returning to Japan by any means possible. He gave each small vials of potassium cyanide in case of capture. The secrets must be kept, he commanded. Even if they follow you to the grave. Then the Doctor of Death himself disappeared. He shaved his beard, dressed in farmer's clothes, and blended into the stream of refugees fleeing the Soviet Red Army. To perfectly conceal his tracks, he even staged a false funeral for himself in his hometown, claiming that Shiro Ishii had died on the journey back from Manchuria. The monster had retreated into the shadows, carrying the war's most terrifying secrets. The price of silence. When the Allies, primarily the Americans, entered to occupy Japan, they began the hunt for war criminals. Just like in Germany, they wanted to bring the perpetrators to justice. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, oversaw the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, and the name Shiro Ishii was at the top of the wanted list. The Americans knew what he had done. Although Pingfang was destroyed, and the Soviets, who occupied the area, were keeping silent, intelligence had leaked. They knew about the biological warfare experiments. They knew about the scale of Unit 731. They began a relentless search for Ishii, but he had vanished without a trace. For over a year, Ishii remained in hiding. But finally, in 1946, U.S. intelligence located him. Not in a bunker, not in a shootout. He was living in relative comfortable seclusion in his own hometown. He was arrested. Justice seemed about to be served. Shiro Ishii, the butcher of Manchuria, should have sat in the front row at the Tokyo Tribunal, next to Prime Minister Hideki Tojo and other military leaders. He should have faced the death penalty for crimes against humanity, but his seat at the dock remained empty. What happened? As American interrogators began questioning Ishii, another group recognized his value. These were scientists from Fort Detrick, Maryland, the U.S. military's own biological warfare research center. What Ishii possessed was not just evidence of crimes. It was a treasure trove of scientific data. 1,000 carefully preserved pathology slides detailing the effects of anthrax on human lungs, live vivisection reports, data on the effectiveness of different plague strains, results from field testing weaponized bacteria under real-world conditions. This was the kind of data that American scientists, bound by ethical conventions and international law, could never have produced themselves. It was the result of decades of research, paid for by hundreds of thousands of human lives. And in the context of the nascent Cold War, as the Soviet Union quickly turned from ally to adversary, this data cache was deemed priceless. It could give the United States a decisive strategic advantage in the impending biological arms race. A cold decision was made at the highest levels. Justice had to yield to national interest. General MacArthur, through his subordinates, offered Shiro Ishii a deal with the devil. Ishii and all the personnel of Unit 731, from the operating surgeons to the technicians, would hand over all their data, all their research, all their knowledge to the United States. They had to reveal everything they knew. In exchange, complete immunity from prosecution. Shiro Ishii, the mastermind of the most perverse experiments of the 20th century, agreed. He sold his bloody secrets for freedom. The cover-up began. The United States actively suppressed the truth about Unit 731. They lied to the Soviets, who were also trying to prosecute Ishii. They dismissed accusations from China. They classified the documents as top secret. Shiro Ishii's crimes were never brought to light at the Tokyo tribunal. He never had to answer for what he had done. After handing over the data, Ishii was released. He returned to civilian life, and his legacy was even more terrifying. The doctors of Unit 731, those who had vivisected the living, those who had sown the plague, were also granted immunity. They returned to Japanese society as respected citizens. They were not punished. On the contrary, they were promoted. Many of them became leading figures in Japan's post-war medical world. They became professors at prestigious medical universities. They became presidents of medical associations. They founded pharmaceutical companies. Some even became governors and high-ranking government officials. The knowledge they gained from the atrocities at Pingfang became the foundation for their successful careers. The pain of hundreds of thousands of victims was buried beneath the silence of Cold War politics. And Shiro Ishii? He lived the rest of his life in relative seclusion, protected by the secret agreement with the United States. He never expressed a single shred of remorse for what he had done. He believed he was a patriotic scientist who had done what was necessary for his country. In 1959, in a Tokyo hospital, nasopharyngeal cancer finally did what the Allied tribunal failed to do: end Shiro Ishii's life. He died in a hospital bed. A tranquil death. Meanwhile, in Manchuria, the land that was once his living hell, the ground is still contaminated. Unexploded bacterial bombs are still occasionally found. And the souls of the Maruta, the anonymous logs, will forever remain without justice. The truth about Unit 731 was concealed for decades. But crimes too vast cannot be buried forever. The data may have been sold, but the memory remains. Evil may have triumphed in the life of Shiro Ishii, but his story is a permanent reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not those who carry guns, but those who wear the white coat of the laboratory.